The tides were curiously high and rough that afternoon. Henry and Jude stood at the bow of a well-ventured ship, enjoying the spray on their sun-kissed skin while they could. The unceasing, merciful trade winds filled the black sails of the briny Fang, speeding them toward the American colonies.
So what's the plan once you get there?
Henry asked his shipmate, taking in the sea air.
As soon as I'm paid up with the captain, I'm shoving off the Fang for good. As beautiful a ship she is.
Jude affectionately slapped the wet, sturdy railing.
Aye,
Henry said in support. The two sailors abhorred the setting sun together. It was like fire in the sky and signaled the beginning of another long, uncomfortable night on the open ocean. But then they caught a whiff of something burning. The scent was heavy, but it wasn't coming from their own vessel. And then they heard a chorus of bone-chilling screams off in the distance. The sound flowed over the top of the water from somewhere just beyond the scorched horizon. They take the news to Captain Brackish, who logs their concerns but reminds them of his strict rules. He appreciated their bleeding hearts, but forbade them from intervening, despite the sea code to rescue anyone in need at sea. For tonight was an exception. In fact, the briny Fang was exceptional in every way, especially on nights of a full moon. Henry and Jude returned to their watch on the forecastle. The screams had stopped now. The silence was gut-wrenching, and the men exchanged unsettled looks. They shrugged off the cold and peered off into the slowly darkening sky, which the stars began to perforate. Something caught Henry's keen eye. A piece of debris was slowly making its way toward them, climbing over the waves and tumbling under their ship's bow, where it was crushed to bits. More discernible objects began to appear from afar. Barrels, tables, chairs, and ornate doors, all charred black, struggled to stay afloat despite their buoyancy. And then came a grisly sight. The bodies of shipwrecked men, women, and children were strewn over the furniture, still clinging to each other. They must have died from the smoke, cold, and exhaustion. Henry and Jude glanced at each other, regretful they weren't able to do more to help. But redemption came the very next moment, when they heard the little cries of a child somewhere on the twilight-colored sea.
Please, help us!
Jude raced to the crow's nest and began to climb, trying to locate her from a greater height. He finally spotted her. She was unconscious and drifting with the aid of a piece of smoking furniture. A little rag doll with a permanent smile was clenched in her hands. He was lucky to spot her at all, since she was buried under a pile of clothing, perhaps trying to stay warm. They couldn't just leave her out there to float into the great abyss. Henry and Jude quietly grappled the floating wreckage and pulled her on board. While she was still fast asleep, they checked her delicately for injuries and found that despite her cloak being singed at the hem and covered with burn holes, she was unharmed. Not even a scratch, thank the moon. They wring out her long, clinging raven-black hair and do their best to warm her. In her pocket was a small but ornate black book. The pages were bare, but it was soaked through. They placed it near the fire to dry. Separating her from her doll instantly roused her.
No, don't you touch her!
The little girl screams, though she's not yet sure at whom she's screaming.
Give her back this instant!
Keep your voice down, girl.
Jude snaps, tossing the doll back into the child's lap.
You're not supposed to be here, so you'd better keep quiet.
And why not? I've paid my way just like the others.
The little girl insisted. She looked around confused, realizing she was no longer on the ship she boarded weeks ago.
Wait, where am I?
Henry answers quietly.
Well, you're on the briny Fang, lass. A merchant ship from England. You've been shipwrecked, dear girl.
Shipwrecked.
Just take a rest.
What's your name, girl? Where were you all headed?
She looks down at her doll, then back up at the strangers. She says desperately,
My name is Amara, and I'm trying to find the colonies. I need to find a woman who can help me. Her name is Miss Clementine.
Well, Amara, you may be in luck. We're heading there now. How old are you?
Henry asks, becoming more invested in her.
I'm...
Amara struggles.
You look about 10, don't you?
Henry suggests.
It's all right, lass. Who are your parents? They weren't, on the ship, were they?
Jude asks.
No, they were dead before.
Henry and Jude somberly lock eyes.
You know we really shouldn't have little girls on board, but we'll have to make an exception tonight.
And why is that?
Amara asks, offended.
Well, because it's
Because
bad
you
luck.
might get...
They both spoke at the same time and gave different answers. Amara now doesn't feel certain she's been saved at all. Henry and Jude try and laugh it off.
Let's just say our captain is a real stickler for the rules, and his bite is certainly worse than his bark.
Jude warns the little girl.
Listen, lass, we'll get you to the colonies, but you need to be quiet and keep out of sight, no matter what you hear or see.
I'm not afraid of either of you.
Amara says defiantly, snuggling her doll close as if to protect her.
We won't hurt you, I promise, as long as you stay hidden.
Henry sneaks Amara and her doll into the small storage room below deck. There was food and water available to her, and she was instructed to take what she needed.
Now remember to keep quiet, Amara.
Jude stares at her sternly. She nods in agreement. As he slowly shuts the door, the sliver of torchlight from outside the cramped, stale room slims until she's finally plunged into darkness.
You hear that, Dolly?
Amara whispers to her ragdoll.
Not one peep.
The doll smiles back, obliging her. The sun had finally made its way past the horizon, and the little girl began to get antsy. In fact, she wasn't tired at all, and she was very hungry. The food in the storage room just wouldn't do at all,
I'll be right back. Don't you worry.
she said to her doll, leaving her safely propped up on the barrels of dried beans and salted pork. Mara scurried around, feeling the energy amongst the sailors heighten as the next hour wore on. They laughed and rioted together. It sounded almost mutinous. She crept through the old creaking ship, finally locating a few young men smoking their tobacco pipes under the moonlight on the main deck. She followed them closely as they made their way onto the forecastle at the front of the ship. Amara prepared to make her first move, nearly salivating. But suddenly, in the distance, a wild wolf howl rumbled the timber of the briny fang and skimmed across the surrounding ocean water. How could she be hearing a wolf out at sea? The men paused and looked at each other, alerted to something. Misplaced smirks crept onto their faces. Unnerved, Amara watched the men as they carefully stashed their pipes in a chest nearby. They stretched their limbs and loosened their clothing. What were they up to? Then suddenly, in the powerful light of the full moon, their faces exploded outwardly, right down the middle. It was as if a weak seam had popped from tension. The little girl was horrified. Their skin looked like wet, fleshy ribbons falling away from their heads. Their scalps and necks slid down their backs and shoulders, revealing new, vein-marbled skin underneath. But they were hairless for only a moment, before varying tones of tough, coarse fur bloomed all over their bodies. Though they were now unrecognizable as anything human, their hands could still be used to grip and pull. Irritably, they ripped away their clothing and human flesh, throwing them over the railings and into the ocean. Amara could hear the monster's stomachs and internal organs rupture, and they grimaced and writhed in pain. Their bones snapped in different directions, thrusting them upward on their new canine legs so that they stood at least 2 feet taller. The gristle of their noses turned into wet snouts, which protruded and darkened. Their old brown teeth filled their mouth, which they spit out onto the deck. Sharp, jagged fangs took their place, and their labored breathing morphed into hoarse, pained yelps. They huffed into the blustery night and regained their new balance on their hind legs. As the light caught their new faces and reflective eyes, it was clear that they had transformed into something straight from Amara's darkest nightmares. She gulped,
They're bloody werewolves.
Instantly, one of them caught the sound of her voice in their raised, cupped wolf ears. He began sniffing the air, determined to catch the outsider. It tilted its head back and bellowed hauntingly into the night, alerting the others. Amara knew she was no match for a werewolf. She ran for her life. Crawling under the ropes and gear on the main deck proved fruitless as they smashed through the barriers with ease. She dove behind one of the large cannons, wishing she was small enough to fit inside. From her pocket, she grabbed her mother's beautiful ruby necklace and quickly clasped it around her neck. Amara tugged upon the stone, seeking comfort. If only she had her doll, she would feel much safer. But it was all futile. The crew finally found her. Their large padded feet creaked the boards next to her. She closed her eyes and hoped they couldn't see her all the same. With one svelte swipe, the monster yanked her up by the hair and swung her into the moonlight to get a better look at its prey. Instinctually, Amara put up a fight. She screeched and gnashed her charming mix of baby and adult-sized teeth at them, but they didn't seem dissuaded from their meal. But then, to her surprise, they didn't eat her, at least not immediately. A pair of werewolves sniffed her head deeply. They seemed to recognize the scent, but couldn't quite place it. But one thing was certain. They knew to resist biting her. To Amara's continued horror, the Alpha, Captain Brackish, emerges from his quarters in beast form. He was of an impressive scale, and quite deadly, made evident by the coarse standing hackles rolling up and down his spine like rogue ocean waves. As brutal as the young werewolves were, the captain was much less patient and prudent. The Alpha yanks Amara away from the pipe-smoking sailors and pulls her across the main deck for the rest of the beastly crew to see. They bark and howl at the sight. Amara wondered if Jude and Henry were amongst them, and if they could still recognize her. The Alpha swings the poor girl through the air by her hair, while he tries to jog his own memory of her scent. Where did she come from? He seems to wonder. The crew cowers but stays close by, loyally awaiting their captain's orders.
Please, let me go. I promise. I'll keep away and stay hidden. I'll behave. I'm so sorry, Captain Brackish.
He barks loudly in her face, and she easily takes it as a resounding no. Amara accepts her fate. Sniffling, she says under her breath,
So, you've all chosen to quarrel then? Well, bloody unfortunate that.
Snake-like fangs pierce through her top gums, causing a rim of blood to line her lips. She slacks her jaw, ready to clasp onto any part of the captain she can sink her teeth into. Now that she understands why she was told to stay hidden, her rescuers must know now why she didn't. She was a dangerous, blood-sucking vampire. Amara hisses at the werewolves and takes vicious swipes at the captain's furry chest with her small but sharp fingernails. The werewolves know her vampire blood would poison them if they bit her, or if she were to bite them. The captain struggles to subdue her, and she gets a few lucky swipes to his face. But he refused to let go of her hair, as it would be highly unlikely he could regain control of her again. He had a pack to protect, and an honorable crew to serve. Amara finally loses enough stamina to battle on, and her body goes limp under Captain Brackish's tight grip on her scalp. Luckily for the werewolves, none of them were bitten. She wipes away tears of frustration and clenches her mother's necklace, the only thing she had left of her. She bares her fangs and curses the crew for what they've done.
I curse you! I curse you all!
She screams above the sound of lurching waves crashing into the sides of the briny fang. Captain Brackish, now deranged with anger, huffs into her face, covering her in wet wolf spittle. A few crew members help him wrestle the little girl down to the deck floor and bind her mouth with rope in such a manner that she's unable to gnaw through it. They were quite nimble even with their canine extremities, having been forced to sail for decades in this state of being. The captain wrapped a pulley rope around her body and began hoisting her up and away from his faithful crew with his teeth. Through the dark forest of masts, they could barely see her or hear her whimpering cries after a while. When he was satisfied with her height and visibility, he fastened off the rope, leaving the poor childlike revenant dangling somewhere between the vast, flapping black sails. Amara struggled with her restraints the whole night, wishing she had her doll to keep her company. What would become of the rag doll, she wondered. She heard the obnoxious barking, sniffing, and yapping of the briny Fang crew below her for hours. But none of them would ever come to her rescue. She eventually drifted off into a deep sleep. She was awoken by the yawns and grumblings of human men now occupying the great ship's decks. She opened her mouth to shout down to them, but the ropes impeded her voice. She tries not to cry, but even after enduring 73 years in the afterlife, in this moment she feels like the little girl from Havenwood Village she once was. From that height, she could already see the hazy halo of the morning sun flowering over the horizon. It frightened and intimidated her, as it had become her one and only master. But apart from the embers of a flaming pyre, she had not seen such a beautiful burning light in ages. She took her fill of the sunrise and closed her eyes, imagining her feet touching the sandy shores of a new land. A little while later, Henry, exhausted from the night's raucous activities, stirs groggily in the blinding sunlight. As soon as he remembers what happened, he darts onto the main deck and searches the black sails for Amara. He looks high and low, trying to remember where they had gibbeted her, and nearly trips over the pile of heavy clothes at his feet. He found her pretty dress and a beautiful ruby amulet necklace. He also recognized the burned holes in the cloak. She was gone, burned to dust by the rising sun and scattered by the ocean breeze. Jude clambers up from below deck to meet him, Amara's still smiling doll in hand. They share the same remorseful gaze, peering around at all the other dazed and lethargic men who had a hand in Amara's demise. Henry caresses Amara's shimmering, hypnotic amulet in his palm.
Not only a little vampire, but a little witch.
Henry says with unsalvageable helplessness.
If we weren't cursed before, we certainly are now.
Jude pockets the doll and helps toss some of Amara's effects over the side of the briny Fang in an unceremonious, lackluster sea burial. The cursed crew of the briny Fang continues on to the French colonies of the New World, looking forward to leaving last night in their nightmares.